I spent $90,000 on a family vacation to a luxury villa in Malibu. But as we stood at the first-class check-in counter at the airport, my own son looked me dead in the eye and said he forgot to buy my ticket. His wife smirked and told me to just go home. They planned to leave me behind from the very beginning to steal my peace and my money. The next day, I had 85 missed calls from them. My name is Oscar Hayes. I am 70 years old, and what I am about to tell you will change how you view family loyalty forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 at the International Airport hummed brightly above us. The light cast a sterile glow over the bustling morning crowd. The line for the first-class check-in was short. It was filled with executives in tailored suits and wealthy families dragging designer luggage. I stood quietly behind my 38-year-old son, Kendall. I was holding my worn leather travel bag in my hands. My heart was full of quiet joy. We were supposed to be heading to Malibu for a 3-week family retreat. It was a trip I hoped would bridge the growing distance between us since my beloved wife, Corinne, passed away. Kendall stepped up to the mahogany ticketing counter. He handed over a neat stack of passports to the airline agent. I reached out and extended my own passport to add to the pile. Kendall took it from my hand. But instead of sliding it across the polished surface to the agent, he abruptly slipped it into the inner pocket of his expensive blazer. He turned to me with a completely blank expression. His face was devoid of any warmth or hesitation or guilt. The ticketing agent smiled politely and asked if we were checking in 3 passengers for the flight to Los Angeles. Kendall shook his head firmly and said there were only 2. He looked directly at me. His jaw was set tight. He stated flatly that my name was not on the reservation. He claimed there had been a booking error and the flight was completely full. He said I would have to stay behind. The betrayal hit me with the sudden crushing force of a physical blow. A son I had raised with my own hands was abandoning me. The boy I had protected and provided for his entire life was leaving me in the middle of a crowded airport terminal as if I were a piece of misplaced luggage. I looked at Kendall, waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. I expected him to crack a smile and hand over my boarding pass, but there was no joke. His wife Courtney stepped forward. She eliminated any doubt about their intentions. She was 32 years old and draped in a pristine white cashmere coat. She wore oversized designer sunglasses that could not hide the absolute disdain radiating from her eyes. Courtney crossed her arms defensively and let out an exasperated sigh. Her posture radiated an arrogant superiority. She did not even attempt to lower her voice as she told Kendall this was for the best. She looked me up and down. Her gaze lingered mockingly on my simple, unbranded sweater and my comfortable walking shoes. She stated that Malibu was a highly exclusive area. She said my presence would only draw the wrong kind of attention. She muttered that her parents, Arthur and Diane, were flying out to meet them there. She told her husband that my outdated working-class style would ruin the aesthetic of their luxury trip. The microaggressions were not new to me. Courtney had always carried a quiet and venomous prejudice. She treated me less like a father-in-law and more like an inconvenient, embarrassing relic of a past she wished Kendall would erase. She leaned in and whispered to Kendall loudly enough for me to hear. She said an old black man wandering around a high-end beachfront property would just make their wealthy white friends uncomfortable. Kendall did not defend me. He did not utter a single word of protest to protect his father. The boy I had taught to walk simply nodded in silent agreement with his wife and her blatant disrespect. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out a single $50 bill. He shoved it into my calloused hand with dismissive and insulting pity. It was the kind of pity one might reserve for a beggar on the street. He told me to take a cab home. He promised to call me when they returned in 3 weeks. He told me not to cause a scene. They did not know that silence is sometimes the loudest and deadliest weapon. I did not scream. I did not yell or demand an explanation in the middle of the terminal. I simply looked at the crisp $50 bill resting in my palm. My hands were rough. They bore the permanent marks of 40 years working as a construction engineer. I had built an empire from the ground up. I started with nothing but a hard hat and calloused hands and a relentless work ethic. I had quietly amassed a massive fortune that Kendall and Courtney could not even begin to comprehend. I lived simply. I drove an old truck and wore plain clothes because I valued substance over flashy displays of wealth. Just 2 days prior, I had handed Kendall my unlimited black card to book this entire vacation. I had personally paid $90,000 for the private Malibu villa. I paid for the first-class flight tickets they were currently holding. I paid for the luxury car rentals waiting for them in California. I had funded the very trip they were now kicking me off of. They assumed I was just a naive and technologically illiterate old man handing over his life savings. They thought I was entirely oblivious to their deceit. They thought they had successfully scammed me out of a luxury vacation to entertain Courtney and her arrogant parents. They expected me to shuffle away in shame. They expected me to be defeated and heartbroken and completely powerless. I looked Kendall in the eye one last time. I searched his face for any remaining trace of the son Corinne and I had loved so deeply. I did not see my son anymore. I saw a parasitic stranger who had willingly chosen greed and superficial status over his own blood. I took the $50 bill. I folded it neatly with deliberate slowness and placed it securely in my pocket. I looked at both of them and told them to have exactly the trip they deserved. Courtney smirked. She clearly mistook my calm composure for weakness and submission. She linked her arm tightly through Kendall, and they turned their backs on me. They walked toward the VIP security line without a single glance over their shoulders. They walked away with the confident, arrogant stride of predators who believed they had successfully cornered and defeated their prey. I turned around and walked out of the bright terminal. The cool morning air hit my face as I stepped up to the airport taxi stand. I slid into the back seat of a yellow cab and gave the driver my home address in a steady and unwavering voice. As the car pulled away from the bustling curb and merged into the highway traffic, I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. I did not call Kendall to beg for an explanation. I did not cry over the profound betrayal. Instead, I dialed the exclusive concierge number reserved for my global black card services. A highly polite representative answered almost immediately, recognizing my account status. My voice was completely ice-cold as I provided my strict authorization code. I instructed the representative to immediately flag and cancel every single transaction made on my account within the last 72 hours. I ordered the total and immediate cancellation of the $90,000 Malibu villa reservation. I canceled the luxury car rentals and the private chef services and every other associated booking. I then requested an absolute and irreversible freeze on the supplementary credit card I had mistakenly issued in Kendall's name. The representative confirmed that the cancellations and the account freeze would take effect instantly. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat back and watched the city skyline roll past the window. The hunt had officially begun. They wanted to leave me behind, but they were about to discover what it truly means to be stranded with absolutely nothing. The yellow cab dropped me off at the end of my driveway. My house in an affluent but quiet Atlanta suburb stood silent and empty. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The stillness of the foyer wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I walked straight into my study and sat down in my worn leather armchair. I did not turn on the television. I did not pour myself a drink. My mind was operating with the cold precision of a blueprint. I placed my phone on the mahogany desk and activated the speaker. The global concierge representative was still on the line waiting for my final confirmation. I instructed him to proceed with the total liquidation of the itinerary. He read back the list of cancellations. A luxury beachfront estate in Malibu reserved for 21 days. Canceled. 2 high-end sports car rentals waiting at Los Angeles International Airport. Canceled. The private chef booked to prepare their welcome dinner. Canceled. The representative informed me that because the cancellations were happening on the same day as the reservations, I would forfeit a significant portion of the deposit. I told him I did not care about the penalty fees. I told him to burn it all down to the ground. I watched the digital clock on my desk ticking forward. Every passing minute solidified my decision. I authorized the immediate suspension of the supplementary platinum credit card holding Kendall's name. The representative confirmed the card was now permanently blocked. Any attempt to swipe it would result in an immediate decline code. I thanked the man and ended the call. The silence returned to the room, but this time it was not a lonely silence. It was the sound of total and absolute control. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my hands. They were scarred and calloused. 40 years ago, I was just a young black man carrying heavy steel beams on dusty construction sites in the sweltering Georgia heat. I worked double shifts under the scorching sun while my beautiful late wife Corinne managed our tight budget at the kitchen table. We skipped vacations entirely. We drove beat-up sedans that broke down every winter. I poured every ounce of my sweat and blood into building my own commercial construction firm. I fought tooth and nail for every contract in a corporate world that constantly tried to shut me out and look past me. When my company finally took off and the millions started rolling in, I made a silent promise to myself. I promised that my son Kendall would never have to break his back the way I did. I wanted him to have the education and the privileges I was brutally denied. I paid for his Ivy League tuition in cash. I bought his first luxury apartment outright. I gave him a high-paying executive title at my firm, even though he lacked the discipline to actually run a department. I built a massive financial fortress around him to keep him safe from the harsh realities of the world. Corinne would have been heartbroken to see the man our son had become. She raised him to be respectful and grounded, but the moment he married into Courtney's family, he discarded every value we instilled in him. He traded his heritage and his pride for country club memberships and shallow approval. My intense protection had only made him weak. It turned him into an entitled coward who allowed a woman like Courtney to disrespect his own father in public. I thought about Courtney. I thought about her sneering face at the airport. She came from a family of pseudo-intellectuals who constantly talked down to me. Her parents, Arthur and Diane, liked to pretend they were old money, but their lifestyle was entirely funded by debt and sheer pretension. Courtney looked at my simple clothes and saw an uneducated old man. She did not realize that the very clothes on her back and the roof over her head were heavily subsidized by the construction empire I built from dirt and concrete. Right at this exact moment, Kendall and Courtney were cruising at 30,000 feet. I pictured them lounging in their plush first-class pods. Courtney was probably sipping expensive champagne and taking photos for her social media followers to brag about her upcoming Malibu retreat. Kendall was likely browsing a luxury watch catalog, completely oblivious to the reality awaiting him. They were floating high above the clouds, wrapped in a false sense of absolute security. They had no idea that their financial parachute had just been slashed to ribbons. They had no idea that the safety net they had relied on their entire adult lives was permanently gone. The $90,000 vacation was now nothing but a mirage. When that plane touched down in Los Angeles, there would be no sleek black car waiting at the curb to whisk them away. There would be no panoramic ocean views or private chefs preparing their gourmet meals. There would only be the harsh, cold pavement of the real world. I had funded their delusion for far too long. I had tolerated Courtney and her subtle racist remarks because I wanted to keep the peace for my son. I had ignored the way she rolled her eyes when I spoke about my past. I had ignored the way she excluded me from family dinners and holiday photos. But leaving me stranded at Terminal 4 was the fatal mistake that shattered the illusion. They had mistaken my quiet patience for foolishness. They mistook my age for senility. They were about to learn that a man who knows how to build an empire from scratch also knows exactly how to tear it down brick by brick. I felt no sorrow as I sat in my study. I only felt a deep and absolute clarity. The bank had locked the accounts. The reservations were wiped from the system. The trap was set, and the jaws were ready to snap shut. I stood up from my leather armchair and walked out of the study. I headed toward the kitchen to brew a strong pot of black coffee to steady my racing mind. As I passed the long mahogany dining table, my eyes caught something out of place. It was a thick manila folder sitting near the edge of the polished wood. Courtney had been sitting right there yesterday evening while complaining loudly about how stressful packing was. She must have left it behind in her arrogant rush to leave for the airport this morning. I walked over and picked up the heavy folder. There was no label on the outside to indicate its contents. I flipped it open, expecting to see travel brochures or hotel pamphlets for their glamorous California getaway. Instead, my eyes fell upon thick stacks of legal documents carrying the bold letterhead of a prominent wealth management firm. I began to read the dense paragraphs. The legal jargon was highly complex, but my decades in business made it perfectly clear. It was a comprehensive power of attorney contract combined with a direct asset transfer authorization. The documents were meticulously drafted to grant Kendall complete legal control over my private retirement fund. But it did not stop there. The secondary paperwork outlined a sophisticated transfer of those exact funds into a holding company registered under the names of Arthur and Diane. The trip to California was never just a vacation. It was a highly calculated distraction. They had planned to strand me at home while they spent 3 weeks finalizing the theft of my entire life savings. My own son was orchestrating my financial ruin. The heavy manila folder rested in my calloused hands. I read through the dense legal clauses again and again to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. The plan laid out on those crisp white pages was terrifyingly brilliant and utterly devoid of a single ounce of empathy. While I was supposed to be kept busy looking at the ocean from a Malibu balcony, Kendall was going to use his executive position in my firm to finalize this paperwork. By leaving me stranded at the airport, they had ensured I was too humiliated and isolated to notice what they were doing with my accounts back home. The documents outlined a direct pipeline from my secure retirement trust into a newly established holding company. The trust contained over $4 million I had carefully invested over my 40-year career. I recognized the name of the holding company immediately. It was the exact same corporate entity Courtney's father Arthur used to prop up his failing logistics business. My own son was not just stealing from me. He was actively financing the lavish lifestyle of a white family that looked down on him. Kendall was willing to drain the fortune I built with my bare hands just to buy the temporary approval of his racist in-laws. The $90,000 vacation was nothing but a smokescreen. It was a massive diversion tactic to keep me completely oblivious while they executed the final devastating transfer. They thought an old black man would be too confused by the digital banking transfers to catch on before the money disappeared offshore. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was not sadness. Sadness is an emotion reserved for when you lose something you love. What I felt was the chilling and absolute resolve of a man preparing for a ruthless war. Corinne and I had sacrificed everything to give Kendall a head start in life. He took that head start and used it to sprint toward our destruction. I closed the folder and placed it perfectly in the center of the mahogany dining table. I turned off the lights and went upstairs to sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in years. The morning sun poured through the large bedroom windows and illuminated the quiet house. I took my time getting out of bed. I walked down to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of strong, dark roast coffee. The rich smell of the roasted beans filled the air. I poured myself a mug and finally walked over to my desk to check my phone. The digital screen lit up with a staggering notification. 85 missed calls. There were also 42 unread text messages and 12 voicemails. I sat down in my leather chair, took a slow sip of my coffee, and pressed play on the first voicemail. The message was time-stamped at 3 p.m. Pacific time. Kendall sounded mildly annoyed. His tone was laced with that arrogant impatience he always used when things did not instantly go his way. He demanded I pick up the phone because there was some ridiculous glitch with the black card. He complained that the rental agency at the Los Angeles airport was giving them a hard time about the luxury sports cars. He ordered me to call the bank and fix it right away because Courtney was getting tired of waiting in the lobby. I smiled and played the next message. It was time-stamped an hour later. The annoyance had morphed into genuine frustration. Background noise indicated they were no longer at the airport. Kendall shouted into the phone asking what the hell I was doing. He complained that he had to use his own debit card to hail a premium rideshare. He said they were standing outside the gates of the Malibu villa and the access code was not working. He sounded furious as he explained that the property manager told him the reservation was pulled and the deposit was forfeited. He demanded I call him back immediately and fix my mistake. The third voicemail arrived 3 hours later. The arrogance was completely gone. In its place was the unmistakable sound of creeping panic. Kendall's voice was shaky and out of breath. He begged me to pick up. He confessed that his supplementary platinum card was declining everywhere. He said the hotel concierge in Beverly Hills practically laughed at them when they tried to book a room. He whispered that Courtney was screaming at him and that her parents were landing in 2 hours. They had absolutely no place to put them. He admitted he did not have the funds to book 5-star suites out of pocket. He pleaded with me to tell him this was just a security freeze. The next voicemail was pure chaos. I could hear Courtney crying in the background, complaining about her ruined designer shoes. Kendall was hyperventilating. He said they tried to go to a luxury restaurant to figure things out, but his card was declined at the table. They had to leave their expensive luggage with the manager just to cover a simple meal. The final voicemail was left at midnight Pacific time. The background noise was the sterile, echoing hum of an airport terminal. Kendall was whispering frantically. He was clearly trying to hide his utter desperation from his furious wife. He begged me for help. He said they had to come back to the airport. He whimpered that Courtney's parents were absolutely livid. Arthur had to pay for a cheap motel near the runway because all of Kendall's cards were completely dead. He admitted he could not access the trust funds or the joint accounts. He realized I had locked him out of everything. He said they were sitting on plastic chairs at baggage claim and Courtney was threatening to leave him. He pleaded that I could not leave them stranded out there with no money. I listened to his voice crack and break. I felt absolutely nothing. For decades, I had rushed to fix every minor inconvenience in his life. I had smoothed out every bump in his road. This time, I was the one who had paved the road with broken glass, and I was going to make sure he walked every single mile of it barefoot. I deleted the voicemails one by one. I watched the messages disappear from the screen with profound satisfaction. Right as I finished deleting the final message, the phone vibrated in my hand. The caller ID flashed Kendall's name. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly swiped to answer. I did not say a word. I just listened. It was not Kendall on the other end. It was Courtney. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with unhinged entitlement. She bypassed any greeting and immediately started screaming into the receiver. She called me a vindictive old man and demanded I turn the credit cards back on right now. She shrieked, asking if I had any idea how much embarrassment I had caused her prestigious family. She yelled that her father had to sleep in a disgusting 2-star motel instead of a beachfront estate. She accused me of deliberately ruining her luxury vacation and humiliating her in front of her country club friends. She threatened to call her expensive lawyers the second she got back to Atlanta. She swore they were going to sue me for emotional distress and financial sabotage. She paused to catch her breath, clearly expecting me to cower and apologize. She expected the quiet, accommodating black father-in-law to beg for forgiveness to keep the peace. Instead, I took another slow sip of my coffee. I spoke with a voice as cold and hard as concrete. I told Courtney that before she called her lawyers, she might want to ask Kendall about the thick manila folder she carelessly left on my dining room table yesterday morning. I specified that it was the folder detailing their brilliant criminal plan to steal my $4 million retirement fund. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. The line went completely dead. I pressed the end call button and set the phone down. The silence in my kitchen lasted exactly 4 minutes before the phone lit up again. The caller ID did not display Kendall or Courtney this time. It flashed the name Arthur Vance. I stared at the glowing screen. Arthur was Courtney's father. He was a man who wore his supposed old money pedigree like a cheap cologne. I pressed the answer button and placed the phone flat on the mahogany desk, letting the speakerphone broadcast his voice across the room. Arthur did not bother with a greeting. His voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with the kind of practiced, arrogant condescension that he usually reserved for valet drivers and waitstaff. He demanded to know what kind of childish tantrum I was throwing. He spoke slowly, over-enunciating his words, as if he were addressing someone with a severe learning disability. Diane, his wife, was clearly hovering right next to the receiver. I could hear her theatrical sighs of disapproval in the background. Arthur told me that abandoning my own son and his daughter at the airport was a pathetic display of blue-collar bitterness. He boldly stated that he always knew Kendall lacked a certain refined backbone, heavily implying that my son's flaws were entirely genetic and inherited from my side of the family. He told me that my actions were a disgraceful embarrassment to their social circle. I sat perfectly still. I listened to this mediocre man insult my parenting, my character, and my lineage from 3,000 miles away. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill the void with his own bloated ego. Arthur took my silence as submission. He scoffed loudly into the receiver, clearly feeling victorious. He boasted that my little stunt was nothing more than a minor logistical hiccup for a man of his stature. He proudly announced that he was taking control of the situation. He declared he would simply put the entire Malibu villa reservation, the luxury car rentals, and the 5-star dinners on his own corporate platinum card. He wanted me to know that his daughter would not suffer just because her father-in-law lacked the basic social grace to understand how wealthy families operate. Diane chimed in, her voice sharp and grating. She muttered that you can take a man out of the dirt, but you can never wash the dirt off the man. She claimed my crude behavior was exactly why they rarely invited me to their exclusive galas. They viewed me as nothing more than an uncultured bank account, and now that I had closed the vault, they were fully unmasking their deep-seated racial and classist hostility. Arthur finished his tirade by warning me to stay away from the newlyweds when they returned. He confidently stated that his family took care of their own, and that they no longer needed my dirty construction money to maintain their lifestyle. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile. I spoke quietly and evenly. I told Arthur that I highly encouraged him to cover the $90,000 tab. I wished him the absolute best of luck at the checkout counter. Then, without waiting for his inevitable bluster, I ended the call. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed a private number. It belonged to Marcus Harrington, my personal attorney and the managing partner of one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in Atlanta. Harrington and I had been to war together against corrupt developers and predatory city councils for over 30 years. He was a legal shark who understood the exact mechanics of dismantling an opponent. He answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave him Arthur's full name and the exact name of his vaunted import-export business. I instructed Harrington to deploy his forensic accounting team immediately. I wanted a complete, exhaustive, and entirely discreet dive into Arthur's financial reality. I wanted to see his corporate tax filings, his liquidity ratios, his outstanding liabilities, and any hidden liens on his precious real estate. I wanted every skeleton dragged out of his designer closet by the end of the business day. Harrington did not ask questions. He simply promised to have the dossier on my desk before sunset. I spent the afternoon tending to the rose bushes Corinne had planted in the backyard. The physical labor kept my mind focused. The sun began to dip below the tree line when my encrypted email chimed. It was a secure file from Harrington. I walked back into my study, opened my laptop, and broke the encryption password. The report was nearly 50 pages long, but the executive summary painted a picture so pathetic it almost made me laugh out loud. Arthur was not a wealthy titan of industry. He was a desperate drowning man grasping at straws. His import-export company was a hollow shell entirely propped up by high-interest corporate debt. They had lost their primary distribution contracts over a year ago. Arthur had completely maxed out his business credit lines to maintain his country club memberships and Diane's shopping habits. He had secretly taken out a second and third mortgage on his primary residence. The bank had already issued 3 notices of intent to foreclose. Arthur did not have the money to pay for a cheap motel room, let alone a beachfront mansion in Malibu. The horrific truth finally clicked into absolute focus. The convoluted legal documents I found on my dining table were not just a greedy cash grab to upgrade their luxury lifestyle. They were an emergency bailout. My $4 million retirement trust was the only thing standing between Arthur's family and total catastrophic bankruptcy. Kendall was willing to rob his own father blind to save his racist in-laws from financial ruin and public humiliation. Arthur's boasts on the phone were nothing but a desperate bluff. He was standing in a California airport with absolutely zero credit, surrounded by the crushing reality of his own demise. My money was their life raft, and I had just set it on fire. 3,000 miles away, reality struck Arthur Vance with the brute force of a swinging sledgehammer. I did not need to be physically present in the opulent lobby of that overpriced Beverly Hills boutique hotel to picture the exact sequence of his profound humiliation. My private investigator, arranged swiftly through Harrington, was already positioned quietly in the lounge area. He was feeding me live updates via encrypted text messages. Arthur approached the polished marble front desk with the exaggerated swagger of a billionaire savior. He loudly slapped his heavy gold-plated corporate credit card onto the counter to secure 5-star suites for his stranded daughter and son-in-law. The desk clerk swiped the card with a practiced, deferential smile. The machine beeped harshly, flashing a stark red decline code. Arthur, attempting to maintain his arrogant facade, chuckled nervously and blamed a banking security freeze. He demanded they run it again. Declined. He dug into his wallet and handed over a second card. Declined. He finally slapped down a third, a personal platinum card Diane kept strictly for luxury shopping sprees. Declined. The clerk's polite smile slowly morphed into a mask of cold corporate suspicion. Arthur's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He demanded the clerk run the numbers manually, raising his voice and causing a desperate scene in the quiet, elegant lobby. Wealthy guests in designer clothes paused to stare at the commotion. The illusion of his generational wealth shattered right there under the crystal chandeliers. Without a valid credit card to hold for incidentals, the hotel security politely but firmly asked the entire Vance family to vacate the premises immediately. Arthur was totally exposed. The Grand Savior had no life raft, no leverage, and absolutely no money. With Arthur utterly humiliated and financially paralyzed, the burden of survival fell squarely on Kendall's weak shoulders. Standing on the sun-baked sidewalk outside the hotel, surrounded by their useless designer luggage, my son pulled out his phone. I knew exactly what his next move would be. For years, Kendall had cultivated a carefully curated inner circle of young Atlanta socialites, country club heirs, and tech executives. He bought their loyalty and their friendship by constantly picking up the tab for lavish dinners, chartering private yachts, and covering VIP bottle service at exclusive clubs. He truly believed he was the undisputed king of his social scene. He pulled up his contact list, ready to beg his wealthy peers for an emergency wire transfer to save face. But I had already anticipated his desperation. Hours earlier, sitting quietly in my study, I had compiled a master mailing list of every single person in Kendall's elite network. I drafted a concise, highly professional email. I attached 36 months of certified bank statements, wire transfer logs, and credit card payment histories. Every single luxury they flaunted was clearly traced back to my personal construction holding accounts. The imported sports cars, the penthouse mortgage, the designer wardrobes, the five-figure bar tabs all had my signature on the checks. I had funded his lifestyle because I remembered the biting sting of poverty and wanted him to walk into boardrooms without the weight of financial insecurity dragging him down. But instead of building upon the solid foundation I provided, he used my money to construct a hollow monument to his own vanity. He used my wealth to buy access to rooms where men like Arthur made racist jokes behind closed doors. By revealing the financial truth to his friends, I was not just cutting off his money. I was completely destroying the fake identity he had painstakingly built. I laid out the indisputable math in the email and hit send. The truth exploded across Atlanta's high society like a detonated bomb. The facade of the self-made wealthy young executive was instantly and permanently obliterated. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Kendall was nothing more than an overgrown child living off a secret allowance from his working-class, blue-collar black father. I watched my phone screen as the notifications rolled in. One by one, Kendall's wealthy friends texted him back, but not with the bailout money he desperately needed. They sent screenshots of my mass email. They sent messages dripping with brutal mockery and sheer disgust. I received a forwarded text from one of his closest country club buddies that read, "Looks like Daddy cut your allowance, Kendall lose my number." Another wrote, "We all knew you could not afford those tabs on a junior executive salary, embarrassing." The socialites who had happily lounged on the yachts I paid for were the first to throw him overboard. Some ignored his frantic calls, entirely blocking his number outright. He was systematically excommunicated from the only world he cared about. Stripped of his money and his fake prestige, Kendall was completely defenseless against the wrath of his wife. Courtney turned on him like a starved predator. On that busy California sidewalk, her screaming echoed down the pristine Beverly Hills street. She threw her expensive designer handbag at his chest and unleashed a vicious tirade. She blamed him for the entire catastrophic disaster. She shrieked that he was a pathetic liar who had trapped her in a humiliating nightmare. The subtle microaggressions she usually employed were entirely gone, replaced by venomous insults regarding his worth as a man. She demanded to know how she was supposed to face her friends now that everyone knew her husband was basically a trust fund baby who had just been disowned. She screamed that he was completely useless without his father's wallet. The pure vitriol in her voice stripped away any lingering illusion of love. Diane joined in, piling on the insults, berating Kendall for ruining their family's pristine reputation. Kendall just stood there, absorbing the verbal abuse, clutching his useless phone. He had traded my unconditional love and protection for the conditional, transactional tolerance of these terrible people. Now the transaction was over, and his true value to them was revealed to be absolute zero. Having exhausted every possible avenue for a financial rescue, the group of four had no choice but to retreat to the only place that offered a roof over their heads without asking for a deposit. They dragged their heavy suitcases back to the Los Angeles International Airport. Kendall tried to use his frequent flyer status to gain entry into the exclusive first-class business lounge, desperately hoping to at least secure free food and comfortable seating for his raging wife. But airport security scanners are deeply integrated with global credit networks. When the lounge attendant scanned his boarding pass and the associated frozen accounts, the system flagged him immediately. The attendant informed him that without an active premium credit card or a valid upcoming first-class itinerary, their access was permanently revoked. Courtney demanded to speak to a manager, stomping her foot in a spectacular display of entitled rage. The manager arrived with 2 armed airport security guards. They did not offer apologies or accommodations. They gave a stern warning. The guards physically escorted Kendall, Courtney, Arthur, and Diane out of the plush carpeted lounge and back into the harsh, echoing reality of the main public terminal. My son, who had turned his back on me for a taste of high society, spent that night shivering in his tailored suit. He and his aristocratic in-laws were forced to try and sleep on hard, cold plastic benches near the baggage claim, surrounded by the glaring fluorescent lights and the sweeping brooms of the late-night janitorial staff. The fluorescent lights of the Los Angeles airport were 3,000 miles away, but I could still feel the pathetic echo of my son's desperation. Back in Atlanta, the Monday morning sun bathed the city in a warm golden glow. I sat perfectly upright in a plush leather chair inside the corner office of the regional bank director. My attorney, Marcus Harrington, sat beside me like a coiled spring. Across the thick glass desk, the bank director shifted nervously in his tailored suit. He knew exactly who I was. My construction holding accounts kept his branch highly profitable. He also knew that the documents Harrington had just slid across the table were going to detonate a financial nuclear bomb in the middle of his most prestigious residential loan. I looked at the director with absolute calm. I instructed him to immediately process the paperwork formally, withdrawing my name, my personal assets, and my corporate trust as the primary guarantor on the mortgage for Kendall's luxury estate. Harrington tapped a gold pen against the glass. He reminded the director that according to the strict stipulations I had originally baked into the loan agreement, I held the unilateral right to sever my co-signer status at any moment without prior notice to the occupant. The director swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. He warned me that removing my financial backing would instantly violate the fundamental terms of the mortgage. He stated that Kendall's personal income and credit score were nowhere near sufficient to sustain a multi-million-dollar property on his own. I stared at him without a shred of hesitation. I told him I was fully aware of my son's financial impotence. I picked up the gold pen and signed my name with a steady, deliberate hand. The final life-sustaining financial umbilical cord was officially severed. The director stamped the documents, officially setting the gears of institutional ruin into motion. By removing my backing, the bank was legally obligated to activate the acceleration clause buried deep within the mortgage contract. Kendall was no longer allowed to make monthly payments, even if he somehow managed to scrape the cash together. The bank was demanding the immediate repayment of the entire outstanding balance in full within 48 hours. If the balance was not paid, the property would be seized. The truth of Kendall's grand, opulent life was finally laid bare on a stark banking ledger. For years, he had paraded around Atlanta's most exclusive country clubs, puffing out his chest and acting like a self-made real estate titan. He bragged to Courtney's arrogant parents about his sprawling 5-bedroom smart home in an elite gated community. He let them believe his junior executive salary afforded him a life of sheer aristocratic luxury. The reality was a pathetic illusion. I had paid the massive down payment in pure cash. I had quietly funneled the exorbitant monthly mortgage installments through a blind family trust. My calloused hands, built from decades of hauling steel and pouring concrete in the Georgia heat, had single-handedly financed every square inch of his pretentious castle. Kendall had never contributed a single dime of his own money to the roof over his head. I left the sterile bank building and climbed into my old, reliable truck. I drove straight to the wealthy suburb where my son played his little game of dress-up. I pulled up to the gated entrance, punched in my master override code, and drove up the long, winding driveway of the estate. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped inside. The house reeked of Courtney's expensive, cloying floral perfume and Kendall's unearned arrogance. Abstract modern art hung on the walls and ridiculous luxury furniture filled the living spaces. It was a monument to their vanity, entirely subsidized by my sweat. I did not come alone. I had coordinated with a premier commercial security firm. A team of 4 technicians walked in right behind me. I gave them a simple, unyielding directive. I ordered them to rip out the expensive smart locks Courtney had installed. I had them drill out the deadbolts on every exterior door and replace them with industrial-grade heavy-duty locks. I stood in the foyer and watched as they wiped the digital access codes from the security panel, completely erasing Kendall and Courtney from the system. I disabled the garage door openers and secured the perimeter. Within 2 hours, the house was transformed into an impenetrable fortress. They were permanently locked out of the castle I had built. I walked through the quiet, spacious rooms, feeling the heavy silence of an impending storm. Every expensive rug, every designer throw pillow, every piece of silver reflected their complete lack of respect for the man who provided it. Courtney had frequently hosted lavish brunch parties in this exact kitchen, sipping mimosas with her white affluent friends while complaining about my lack of refined taste. She had looked down her nose at the black man whose bank account kept the lights on and the wine flowing. Her parents, Arthur and Diane, had slept in the luxury guest suites, enjoying the free hospitality while whispering racist microaggressions about my neighborhood origins. They thought they had secured a permanent free ride on my dime. They believed their proximity to my son gave them unrestricted ownership over my hard-earned wealth. but the deed to this property ultimately linked back to my corporate holding company. I was not just evicting a tenant, I was reclaiming my territory from parasites who had infested it. With the security perimeter completely locked down, I made my final move for the afternoon. I pulled out my phone and called a professional hazard cleanup and moving crew. I paid them double their standard rate for extreme urgency and absolute ruthlessness. I instructed them not to pack with care. There would be no bubble wrap for Courtney's fragile vanity and no custom wardrobe boxes for Kendall's tailored suits. The crew arrived with industrial black trash bags and heavy-duty cardboard boxes. I stood on the pristine marble floors and watched as they mercilessly swept through the house. They threw Courtney's thousands of dollars worth of designer shoes, luxury handbags, and high-end cosmetics into the plastic bags. They tossed Kendall's golf clubs, expensive watches, and custom blazers into the cardboard boxes without a second thought. The crew hauled the bags and boxes out the front door and dumped them directly onto the perfectly manicured bright green grass of the front lawn. The mountain of their fake materialistic life piled up under the harsh afternoon sun, exposed for all their wealthy, judgmental neighbors to see. Whispers would undoubtedly start spreading through the gated community before evening. As the crew drove away, I walked up to the newly reinforced mahogany front door. I pulled a crisp official document from my jacket pocket. It was the bank's formal notice of default and immediate property seizure. I used a heavy strip of industrial tape to secure the notice directly at eye level on the front door. I walked down the driveway, got back into my truck, and drove away, leaving their entire illusion of success scattered in the dirt. Without a single functioning credit card and permanently banned from the airport premises, the four of them were forced to face a harsh reality they had mocked their entire lives. Kendall had to swallow his pride and humiliate himself in a grimy strip mall miles away from the airport. He walked into a dingy pawn shop and slid a platinum Rolex watch across the scratched glass counter. It was a watch I had bought for his 30th birthday to celebrate a promotion he never truly earned. The pawnbroker gave him a fraction of its value, handing over a thin stack of cash that barely covered their immediate survival. They did not buy last-minute economy flights. They could not afford to rent a basic sedan. Instead, they found themselves standing under the flickering and buzzing fluorescent lights of a dilapidated long-distance bus terminal in downtown Los Angeles. Courtney stared in absolute horror at the rusted, exhaust-choked coach bus destined for Atlanta. She clutched her pristine cashmere coat tightly to her chest, treating the air around her as if it were highly contaminated. Arthur and Diane looked completely hollowed out. The wealthy patriarch who had arrogantly boasted about bailing them out was now aggressively haggling with an indifferent ticket clerk over the price of 4 one-way coach fares. They boarded the bus in shame and shuffled down the narrow, sticky aisle. There were no plush reclining pods or complimentary champagne flutes. They squeezed into cramped, threadbare seats that smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. The heavy engine roared to life, violently vibrating the floorboards beneath their designer shoes. It was going to be a grueling and agonizing 3-day journey across the country. They were trapped in a metal tube, stripped of their fake prestige and forced to sit shoulder to shoulder with the very working-class people they had spent their entire lives looking down upon. The first 24 hours broke their bodies, but the next 48 hours completely shattered their alliance. As the bus rattled tirelessly through the desolate stretches of the American Southwest, Courtney dropped every remaining shred of her refined country club persona. The cramped and claustrophobic environment became a high-pressure cooker for her vicious entitlement. She turned her venom entirely onto Kendall. She did not lower her voice as she berated him, ignoring the annoyed glances from the other exhausted passengers trying to sleep. She hissed that he was an absolute fraud and a colossal failure. She ridiculed his junior executive title, pointing out that without my bank account propping him up, he was nothing but an empty suit. She dug her perfectly manicured nails into his arm and demanded to know how he could be so stupid as to let an uneducated old man outsmart him. The microaggressions that were once subtle and heavily disguised as polite conversation now spilled out as blatant and venomous insults. Diane and Arthur chimed in mercilessly from the seats across the narrow aisle. Diane muttered loud enough for Kendall to hear that she always knew he was a terrible investment for their daughter. Arthur sneered and stated that Kendall lacked the inherent intellectual pedigree to handle complex financial maneuvers. They spoke about him as if he were a defective product they had accidentally purchased and could no longer return. They blamed his massive failure on his upbringing, making thinly veiled racist remarks about my background and how my money could never buy him true class or intelligence. Kendall sat paralyzed against the scratched, dirty window. He stared out at the passing desert landscape, feeling completely numb. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively distancing himself from my legacy. He had worn my hard-earned wealth like a cheap costume to impress a woman who viewed him with deep and inherent disgust. Now completely stripped of my protection, he was experiencing the raw and unfiltered reality of Courtney's conditional love. She did not love him. She loved the multi-million-dollar safety net I provided. Every time the bus stopped at a dingy gas station or a fast food rest stop, their profound misery compounded. They had to carefully count crumpled dollar bills just to buy stale sandwiches and warm bottled water. Courtney absolutely refused to eat the cheap food. She sobbed uncontrollably into her hands, lamenting her ruined aesthetic and the total social suicide awaiting her back in Atlanta. She shrieked that her friends were already blocking her on social media because of the massive email leak I had orchestrated. She blamed Kendall for her complete social excommunication and the destruction of her flawless reputation. The thick tension reached a boiling point somewhere in rural Texas when Kendall finally snapped. He turned to his wife and told her to shut her mouth. Courtney reacted instantly. She slapped him hard across the face. It was a sharp and echoing crack that immediately silenced the entire bus. The driver slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the shoulder of the highway. He threatened to kick them all off right there in the desert dirt if they did not sit down and stay quiet. For the remainder of the agonizing trip, they sat in thick and suffocating hatred. The alliance forged in greed had completely dissolved into a toxic pool of pure resentment and bitter blame. The exhausting journey finally concluded when the bus hissed to a halt at a grimy downtown Atlanta terminal on a miserable and overcast afternoon. They dragged their heavy, scuffed designer luggage off the bus. They were sleep-deprived, unwashed, and completely broken. Kendall had to spend his very last crumpled $10 bill to convince a reluctant cab driver to take them to the edge of their exclusive gated community. The security guard at the booth, who usually waved them through with a respectful and eager nod, now stared at them with profound confusion as they trudged up the long, winding driveway on foot. Dark gray clouds gathered rapidly overhead, threatening a massive and violent storm. They walked up the steep incline, their legs burning and their lungs aching, desperately anticipating the comfort of their sprawling mansion. They expected a hot shower and a soft bed to wash away the nightmare of the past 3 days. But as they crested the final hill and their property came into view, the true extent of their ruin was finally revealed. Kendall stopped dead in his tracks and dropped his suitcase onto the wet pavement. Courtney let out a blood-curdling shriek of pure horror. Spread across the perfectly manicured bright green grass of their front lawn was a massive mountain of black industrial trash bags and crushed cardboard boxes. The sky suddenly broke open, unleashing a torrential Georgia downpour. The heavy rain instantly soaked through the cardboard, exposing Courtney's ruined designer dresses and Kendall's expensive custom blazers to the thick mud. They sprinted up the driveway in sheer panic, only to be met by the cold and unyielding reality of the heavy-duty industrial locks I had firmly installed. Nailed directly to the center of the heavy mahogany front door was the bank's official notice of default and immediate seizure. They stood shivering in the freezing rain, pounding their fists against a fortress that no longer belonged to them. The freezing Georgia rain battered against the heavy mahogany front door as Courtney pounded her fists against the solid wood. Her knuckles slammed into the reinforced frame with a frantic and unhinged rhythm. The delicate country club facade she had meticulously maintained for years dissolved completely into the muddy puddles at her feet. She tore the bank foreclosure notice from the door and shredded it with her shaking hands. She began to scream. The sound was guttural and raw. It cut through the loud crash of the thunder overhead. She was no longer pretending to be the polite and cultured daughter of old money. She unleashed a torrent of the most vile and disgusting racial slurs imaginable. She screamed that a filthy old black man had no right to touch her belongings. She shrieked that I belonged in the dirt. She weaponized every bigoted thought she had ever harbored against me and my heritage. The venom poured from her mouth without a single ounce of restraint. She cursed my name. She cursed my late wife, Corinne. She demanded that I open the door and surrender her property immediately. Her expensive mascara ran down her pale face in dark and jagged streaks. Her pristine cashmere coat was soaked through and plastered to her shivering frame. She looked like a feral animal trapped in a storm of her own making. Arthur and Diane stood a few feet behind her. They shivered in the pouring rain and nodded in silent agreement with their daughter's racist tirade. They felt completely justified in their hatred. They believed their whiteness and their supposed social standing gave them the absolute authority to demand my wealth. Kendall stood completely frozen on the wet pavement. The heavy rain plastered his tailored suit to his shivering body. He watched his white wife hurl the most degrading racial slurs at his black father. He heard her demean his own bloodline and insult the very legacy that had paid for the shoes on his feet. He did absolutely nothing. He did not grab her arm. He did not tell her to stop. He did not defend the memory of his mother or the dignity of his father. He just stood there like a pathetic and hollow shell of a man. His silence was the final and absolute confirmation of his ultimate betrayal. He had traded his soul and his dignity for a desperate chance to remain in their toxic circle. He was a coward of the highest order. The heavy metallic click of the new industrial deadbolt echoed loudly over the sound of the pouring rain. The thick mahogany door slowly swung open. I stood in the warm and dry foyer. I wore a perfectly pressed charcoal suit and a calm expression that mirrored a frozen lake. I did not hold a weapon. I did not raise my voice to match Courtney's hysterical screaming. I simply looked at the four of them shivering on my front porch like drowned rats. Courtney lunged forward. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest and demanded I let them inside immediately. She threatened to destroy my life. She threatened to call her country club friends and ruin my business reputation. She called me a disgusting thief for throwing her designer clothes onto the wet grass. I did not argue. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I slowly raised my right hand. I held my smartphone perfectly steady. The large screen was illuminated and angled outward for all of them to see clearly. The display showed the live high-definition feed from the newly installed commercial security cameras positioned directly above the porch. I tapped the screen once to reveal the playback archive. I spoke with a voice completely devoid of emotion. I informed Courtney that the audio capture on these new security units was exceptionally crisp. I told her that every single racial slur, every unhinged threat, and every disgusting insult she just screamed had been recorded in perfect clarity. I explained that the footage was already uploaded and safely backed up on an encrypted cloud server. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. The arrogant fire in her eyes instantly extinguished. It was rapidly replaced by a cold and paralyzing terror. I asked her how her elite and progressive social circle would react to a viral video of her screaming racist obscenities on a front porch. I asked Arthur and Diane how their few remaining business partners would feel about their family's blatant bigotry being broadcasted across every local news network in Atlanta. I looked directly at Kendall. I told him that his mother would be deeply ashamed to see the man he had chosen to become. I told him he was no longer my son. He was just another trespasser standing on my property. Before anyone could utter a single word of defense, the sharp and piercing wail of police sirens cut through the heavy storm. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the wet asphalt of the long driveway. 2 patrol cars sped up the incline and screeched to a halt right behind the pile of garbage bags on the lawn. I had called the local precinct 20 minutes ago when my perimeter sensors alerted me to unauthorized individuals breaching the front gate. 4 armed police officers stepped out into the rain. They approached the porch with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Kendall immediately threw his hands up in a desperate panic. Arthur tried to use his arrogant, authoritative voice to command the officers. He foolishly claimed this was a simple family misunderstanding. I calmly handed the lead officer the certified property deed and the official bank foreclosure notice bearing my holding company's name. I clearly stated that these 4 individuals were trespassing on my private commercial property and had been highly verbally aggressive. The lead officer reviewed the documents and turned to Kendall with a stern and uncompromising glare. He ordered all 4 of them to step off the porch immediately. He stated that they had exactly 2 minutes to drag their belongings off the premises. If they refused to comply, they would all be handcuffed and booked into the county jail for criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace. Courtney let out a loud and humiliated sob. She grabbed a soaking wet black trash bag filled with her ruined designer shoes and began to drag it down the muddy driveway. Arthur and Diane followed suit. Their heads hung low in absolute defeat. Kendall looked at me one last time. His face was a mask of total devastation. I stepped back inside and firmly closed the heavy mahogany door. I locked them out in the cold and unforgiving storm. Stripped of her luxury aesthetic and confined to a damp, heavily stained motel room on the outskirts of the city, Courtney resorted to the absolute lowest tactic in her arsenal. The relentless rain had ruined her designer clothes and the brutal eviction had shattered her pride, but her venomous entitlement remained entirely intact. She sat on the edge of a sagging, floral-patterned mattress and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers flew across the digital keyboard with manic, unhinged energy. She was no longer just a spoiled daughter-in-law. She was a cornered predator willing to completely fabricate reality to save her own skin. She logged into her highly curated social media accounts platforms where she usually posted pictures of expensive brunches and five-star resorts paid for by my hard work. She took a carefully staged photograph of her tear-streaked face and wet, tangled hair, deliberately framing herself against the bleak, peeling wallpaper of the cheap motel. Then she began to type a monumental, calculated lie. She crafted a long, agonizing narrative of pure victimhood. She wrote that her husband's father was suffering from a severe, undiagnosed form of paranoid schizophrenia and advanced dementia. She claimed that my mind had completely deteriorated over the past few weeks, turning me into a violent, unpredictable danger to my own family. She painted a heartbreaking picture of a devoted son and a loving daughter-in-law who had only wanted to help a declining patriarch seek medical treatment. According to her completely fabricated story, my response to their loving intervention was a terrifying episode of psychotic rage. She described the eviction not as a legal foreclosure, but as the manic, abusive actions of an insane old man throwing his vulnerable children out into a dangerous storm. She claimed they were fearing for their lives and that Kendall was heartbroken over losing his father to mental illness. She hit publish, weaponizing her white female tears and her affluent network to completely assassinate the character of a black man she despised. The internet is a ravenous machine fueled by synthetic outrage, and Courtney had just served it a 5-course meal. Within the first 2 hours, the post crossed 5,000 shares. By morning, that number had exploded to tens of thousands. Her extensive network of country club wives, wealthy influencers, and bored socialites amplified the fabricated tragedy with astonishing speed. My phone began to buzz incessantly with notifications, blind text messages, and angry emails from people I had not spoken to in years. The comments section of her post devolved into a toxic wasteland of performative sympathy for the young, beautiful, displaced couple. Thousands of strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my life were suddenly diagnosing me with severe psychiatric conditions from behind their digital screens. They branded me a monster. They demanded that Adult Protective Services immediately intervene and place me in a restrictive psychiatric facility. They called for justice for Kendall and Courtney, completely blinded by the flawless execution of her digital manipulation. Seeing the explosive traction of his daughter's post, Arthur saw a golden opportunity to leverage this digital mob into a tangible weapon. Operating from his own miserable motel room, he tapped into his few remaining country club connections and reached out to a managing editor at a prominent sensationalist local Atlanta newspaper. Arthur fed the editor a highly embellished version of Courtney's lies, adding his own false testimonies about my supposed erratic business decisions and aggressive outbursts. The narrative was entirely too tempting for the publication to ignore. It had all the perfect elements of a weekend feature piece, a wealthy, aging construction mogul losing his grip on reality and turning his massive fortune against his own flesh and blood. The article went live the following morning with a glaring headline about a family torn apart by elder mental illness. It cited anonymous sources close to the family who detailed my supposed paranoid delusions. They were sitting in their squalid motel rooms watching the view count rise and reading the blistering newspaper article, firmly believing they had finally outsmarted me. They assumed I cared deeply about my social standing. They thought the threat of public ruin and the destruction of my pristine corporate legacy would force me to the negotiating table. They expected me to panic under the immense weight of the relentless media scrutiny. They believed a proud man who had spent 40 years meticulously building an impeccable professional reputation would rather surrender his fortune and unlock the trust fund than see his name dragged through the mud. They thought they had successfully backed me into a corner using public shaming as a crowbar to pry open my bank accounts. They were waiting for my phone call, fully expecting me to beg for a truce, offer them their house back, and pay off Arthur's debts just to make the digital nightmare stop. The fallout of their vicious smear campaign inevitably breached the heavy oak doors of my corporate headquarters. Early the next morning, Marcus Harrington burst into my private downtown office. He did not bother knocking, a rare breach of protocol for a man who prided himself on absolute composure. His usually immaculate tailored suit looked slightly rumpled, and his face was a tight mask of genuine professional panic. He carried a thick stack of printed social media screenshots and a crumpled copy of the local newspaper. He dropped the massive pile of defamatory lies directly onto my polished mahogany desk. He leaned over, resting his hands on the wood, and warned me that the situation was rapidly escalating into a catastrophic public relations nightmare. He stated that our commercial clients and corporate partners were already calling the firm deeply spooked by the public allegations of my mental incompetence. He urged me to immediately draft a cease and desist order and prepare a massive defamation lawsuit before the board of directors started asking questions about my capacity to lead the company. I did not look at the stack of papers. I did not frown, nor did I reach for my phone to assess the damage. Instead, I slowly reached across the desk for my porcelain teacup. The chamomile blend was perfectly steeped and radiating a gentle, calming heat. I brought the delicate cup to my lips, took a long, deliberate sip, and let the warmth settle comfortably in my chest. I set the cup down precisely on its saucer. I looked up at my frantic, wide-eyed attorney, and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I told Harrington to breathe. I told him not to waste a single billable hour worrying about the fleeting opinions of internet strangers or the sensationalist garbage printed in a local tabloid. I explained that an empire built on solid concrete does not crumble because a few desperate rats squeak in the shadows. I told him that Courtney and Arthur had just made the most spectacular miscalculation of their entire miserable lives. They had given me exactly what I needed. I leaned forward, the smile fading into a look of cold, unyielding resolve. I instructed Harrington to stop worrying about defending my reputation and to immediately start preparing the legal artillery for our next move. They wanted the attention of the public, and I was going to make sure they received every single ounce of it. I did not launch a frantic counterattack on social media. I did not record a tearful video defending my sanity or my character. I bypassed the digital noise entirely and utilized the brute force of traditional institutional power. I instructed Harrington to contact the advertising directors of the 3 largest and most respected newspapers in the state of Georgia. I did not purchase a small column in the back pages. I used my corporate accounts to buy out the entire front page of the Sunday edition for all 3 publications. The sheer cost of this unprecedented media blackout was staggering, but it was a fraction of the peace of mind it would buy me. When Sunday morning arrived, the delivery trucks rolled out across the state carrying my absolute truth. The front pages did not feature sensationalist headlines or political scandals. They featured a stark, minimalist design with a single, bold, open letter addressed to the citizens of Atlanta. I kept the open letter completely devoid of emotional whining. I did not play the victim. I wrote with the clinical precision of an engineer diagnosing a structural failure. I calmly dismantled the fabricated narrative of my supposed mental decline. I explicitly outlined the dangerous reality of elder financial abuse and the toxic entitlement of greedy heirs. I made it clear that I was of perfectly sound mind and had simply chosen to stop financing the extravagant lifestyles of 2 capable adults who harbored deep-seated racial prejudice against me. At the very bottom of the page, printed in stark black ink, was a massive QR code. The brief caption beneath it simply read that the truth does not require anonymous sources. The QR code directed anyone with a smartphone to a highly secure and fully optimized website I had commissioned earlier that week. The website was a digital fortress of undeniable evidence. I did not hide behind vague accusations. I uploaded 3 years of certified bank statements. I posted the exact wire transfer logs proving I had paid the massive down payment on Kendall and Courtney's luxury estate. I displayed the monthly mortgage receipts paid directly from my blind family trust. I included the 85 frantic voicemails Kendall had left me begging for money after his premium credit card was declined at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The public could clearly see the invoice for the $90,000 Malibu vacation I had funded alongside the flight manifests, proving they had deliberately excluded my name from the reservation. I even uploaded the legal documents Courtney had carelessly left on my dining table, exposing their calculated plot to funnel my $4 million retirement fund into Arthur's failing business. But the undeniable crown jewel of the website was positioned at the very top of the homepage. It was the raw, unedited security camera footage from my front porch. I uploaded the high-definition video capturing Courtney in the pouring rain. The crisp audio echoed her vicious and unhinged racial slurs. It showcased her screaming bigoted insults and demanding access to a black man's wealth, while her white parents stood by, nodding in silent approval. It showed my son Kendall standing by in absolute silence, allowing his wife to degrade his own father and his heritage. The internet is a volatile beast, and I had just fed it the absolute undeniable truth. The public opinion reversed with whiplash-inducing speed. The very same influencers and socialites who had fiercely defended Courtney just 48 hours prior were now scrambling to delete their posts. The comment sections turned into a relentless tidal wave of backlash against the Vance family. Courtney's carefully curated social media accounts were flooded with thousands of outraged citizens calling out her blatant racism and financial parasitism. The local tabloid that had published Arthur's sensationalist lies was forced to issue a highly humiliating public retraction to avoid a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit from Harrington. The editor publicly apologized for failing to verify their sources. My financial supremacy and unyielding mental clarity were now on full public display. I was no longer the confused victim they tried to paint me as. I was an untouchable titan who had masterfully orchestrated their complete social ruin. The devastating shockwave of the Sunday papers hit Arthur Vance's fragile logistics company before the weekend was even over. His few remaining corporate partners and supply chain vendors took one look at the viral porch video and immediately severed all ties. No legitimate enterprise wanted to be associated with a family exposed for blatant bigotry and elder financial exploitation. Arthur received swift notices of contract terminations via email while sitting in his cheap motel room. His business, which was already drowning in high-interest debt, was instantly pushed over the edge into total catastrophic collapse. The prestigious country club that Diane and Courtney treated as their personal kingdom held an emergency board meeting. By Monday morning, the club's management dispatched a courier to the motel to revoke the Vance family's lifetime membership, citing a severe violation of their moral conduct clause. They were permanently banned from the golf courses, the dining halls, and the elite social events they built their entire identities around. They were instantly transformed into social pariahs in the exact circles they once ruled. Their reputations were reduced to ash. Friends blocked their numbers, and former associates refused to take their calls. Stripped of his money, abandoned by his friends, and facing the wrath of his entirely ruined in-laws, Kendall found himself backed into a claustrophobic corner. He realized that begging and public shaming had completely failed. Courtney was screaming at him, constantly blaming his incompetence for her total social destruction. Instead of surrendering and begging for genuine forgiveness, he decided to double down on his own destruction. He decided to play one final desperate gamble, utilizing the very medical lie his wife had initially fabricated on social media. Kendall had been backed into a corner of his own making. The public humiliation and financial ruin left him with a singular and treacherous path. He drove to the Fulton County Family Court with a manila envelope clutched in his trembling hands. Inside was an emergency petition for an ex parte guardianship. To convince a judge to bypass standard notification protocols and immediately seize my autonomy, Kendall needed a smoking gun. He presented a newly minted and highly official-looking medical certificate. The document bore the signature of a supposed clinical psychiatrist. It explicitly diagnosed me, Oscar Hayes, with rapid onset and severe dementia, accompanied by dangerous paranoid delusions. Kendall swore under oath that my recent actions, including locking him out of his house and publishing my financial records, were the catastrophic symptoms of my rapidly deteriorating mind. He played the role of the grief-stricken and terrified son to absolute perfection. He stood before the court clerk with his voice breaking, claiming I was liquidating my estate in a manic frenzy and that I posed a severe threat to my own safety. The forged document was an expensive and desperate lie. It was a calculated medical trap designed to weaponize the legal system against an elderly black man. Kendall knew that the courts often acted swiftly and aggressively to protect seniors when presented with clinical diagnoses of cognitive failure. He bet everything on the institutional bias that assumes an aging mind is inherently fragile and easily compromised. The emergency petition did not stop at simply declaring me mentally incompetent. Kendall and Courtney's legal filings demanded the immediate and total freezing of my personal and corporate accounts. They explicitly requested that the court appoint Kendall as my sole and permanent legal conservator. This status would grant him absolute and unchecked authority over every single dollar I had earned over my 40-year career in commercial construction. He would possess the power to sell my properties, liquidate my stocks, and redirect my $4 million retirement trust exactly as he and Courtney had originally planned before I stranded them at the airport. They wanted the state to formally hand them the keys to my empire. Their sheer audacity was entirely driven by suffocating desperation. Drip by drip, the crushing reality of their financial collapse was destroying them. Without my continuous stream of invisible funding, Kendall's facade had evaporated overnight. He and Courtney were forced to abandon the cheap motel when Arthur's last overdrawn card was finally declined. They had moved into a cramped and noisy two-bedroom apartment rented by one of Courtney's few remaining college acquaintances who had not yet seen the viral porch video. The tension in that tiny space was absolutely radioactive. Arthur was facing aggressive litigation from his own commercial creditors, and Diane was selling her designer jewelry to pawn shops just to buy groceries. Kendall was fielding daily calls from hostile debt collectors regarding the multi-million-dollar mortgage default I had triggered. The bank was aggressively moving forward with the public auction of their heavily customized estate. They had literally nothing left but this treacherous legal gamble. If Kendall could successfully convince a family court judge that my brilliant defensive maneuvers were actually the erratic symptoms of a diseased mind, he could legally reverse the damage. He could use his conservatorship powers to reinstate the mortgage payments, pay off Arthur's failing logistics company, and force me into a restrictive and high-security nursing facility where I could never access a bank teller or a lawyer again. Courtney was the invisible architect behind this specific legal maneuver. She had spent hours scouring the internet for a disgraced and suspended psychiatrist willing to sign a fraudulent diagnosis for a heavy cash bribe. They scraped together their last few thousands of dollars, emptying out Kendall's minor personal savings account to purchase the fake medical certificate. It was an incredibly high-stakes crime. Forging medical documents and committing perjury in a family court petition carried severe felony penalties. But when a parasite realizes the host has severed the connection, it will chew through its own limbs just to reattach itself. They were drowning, and pulling me under the water was their only remaining strategy to survive. Kendall truly believed that if he moved fast enough, the judge would grant an interim freeze on my accounts before I even knew what hit me. He assumed the legal system would inherently trust a well-dressed and articulate younger man over an angry 70-year-old. He was banking on the same arrogant assumption he had held his entire life. He thought he was always the smartest person in the room. I was sitting in my backyard, quietly pruning the rose bushes under the warm Georgia sun, when the heavy chime of my front gate buzzer broke the afternoon silence. I wiped the soil from my calloused hands, walked to the security intercom, and verified the visitor. A uniformed process server was standing outside my newly reinforced property line. He was holding a thick manila envelope bearing the official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. I buzzed him through and waited on the front porch. The young man walked up the driveway and handed me the envelope with a professional and entirely detached nod. He informed me that I had been officially served. I took the heavy packet back into my study and broke the seal. My eyes scanned the dense legal summons. It was an order to appear for an emergency competency hearing scheduled for the very next morning. The stakes laid out on the thick paper were absolute and terrifying. If I failed to show up, or if I failed to systematically destroy the forged medical evidence Kendall had submitted, I would lose everything. A single stroke of a judge's pen would strip me of my civil rights. I would lose the ability to manage my own finances, make my own medical decisions, or even choose where I lived. My entire life's work, my freedom, and my dignity were suddenly on the chopping block. The trap was incredibly dangerous, but as I dialed Marcus Harrington's private number, I felt a familiar and cold surge of adrenaline. They had just escalated our family dispute into a federal crime. I instructed my lawyer to prepare for absolute war. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Family Court swung open with a resounding thud. I walked into the brightly lit courtroom wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was as hard as granite. Attorney Harrington walked right beside me, holding a pristine leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my son. Across the room, sitting at the petitioner table, were Kendall and Courtney. They had meticulously dressed for the occasion. Courtney wore a conservative, high-necked beige dress, attempting to look like an exhausted and modest caregiver. Kendall wore a soft gray suit, his shoulders intentionally slumped to project the image of a man carrying a tragic emotional burden. Beside them sat their newly hired attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Prescott, who specialized in aggressive conservatorship battles. The judge entered the room and the emergency hearing commenced immediately. Prescott wasted absolutely no time launching his vicious opening statement. He stood before the judge and painted a horrifyingly distorted portrait of my life. He did not describe a successful retired engineer who had simply cut off his financially abusive family. Instead, he described a tragic and deeply paranoid old man who had completely lost his grip on reality. Prescott pointed directly at me and claimed that my recent actions were textbook symptoms of rapid onset dementia. He weaponized my brilliant defensive maneuvers against me. He told the judge that my decision to change the locks on my own property was a severe manic episode driven by terrifying hallucinations. He argued that the website I published exposing their financial reliance was the reckless and dangerous behavior of a diseased mind attempting to self-destruct. Prescott concluded his opening remarks by insisting that I was in immediate danger to myself and my estate, requiring the immediate intervention of the court to save me from my own psychotic delusions. The judge listened carefully, taking notes while assessing my calm demeanor from the bench. Prescott then called his star witness to the stand. Kendall walked up to the wooden witness box with slow and hesitant steps. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth. What followed was the most sickening and expertly delivered theatrical performance I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Kendall looked directly at the judge with eyes swimming in fabricated tears. He spoke in a hushed and trembling voice that cracked at all the perfectly rehearsed moments. He told the court that it was breaking his heart to stand there today. He claimed he loved his father more than anything in the world, and that watching my brilliant mind decay into paranoia was tearing his soul apart. To fortify his massive lie, Kendall began producing highly sophisticated fabricated evidence. He submitted a stack of forged utility bills and fake collection notices. He held them up and testified that he had been secretly paying my electricity and water bills for the past 6 months because I kept forgetting how to write a simple check. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured pity and claimed I would often wander around my own neighborhood completely disoriented. He even had the audacity to state under oath that there were days I did not recognize Courtney when she came over to bring me groceries. Kendall did not stop at fake bills and imaginary memory lapses. He decided to rewrite the entire history of the Malibu vacation. He looked the judge in the eye and testified that the incident at the airport was actually the terrifying climax of my mental collapse. He claimed that I had suffered a massive and violent psychotic break right there in Terminal 4. He told the court that I had become highly combative and disoriented, screaming that I did not know where I was and demanding to be sent home. He painted himself as the desperate son who had to make the agonizing decision to leave me in a taxi for my own safety, while he flew to California to frantically consult with top-tier neurological specialists on how to handle my worsening condition. The lies flowed from his mouth like toxic sludge. He described the pain of seeing his hero reduced to a paranoid shadow. He pleaded with the judge to grant him full conservatorship so he could place me in a highly specialized, secure memory care facility where I would be kept safe from my own dangerous impulses. The performance was flawless. The courtroom was dead silent. I could see the court reporter looking at Kendall with genuine sympathy. Courtney dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the supportive wife. I sat completely motionless at the defense table. I did not shake my head. I did not interrupt. I simply watched the boy I had raised commit brazen, calculated perjury to steal my empire. The judge turned his attention to my table and asked if my counsel had any questions for the witness. Harrington stood up slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the center of the courtroom with a predator's calm grace. He did not carry a notepad. He did not look at the fabricated utility bills Kendall had submitted. He approached the witness stand and stopped just a few feet away from my son. Harrington did not ask a single question about my mental health. He did not ask about the airport or the supposed memory lapses or the fake bills. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper. It was the heavily redacted signature page of the $4 million retirement trust transfer contract, the exact document Courtney had foolishly left on my dining room table. Harrington unfolded the crisp paper and slapped it face up on the wooden ledge directly in front of Kendall. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet courtroom. Harrington leaned in close and his voice boomed with absolute authority. He demanded that Kendall identify the document. He pointed a steady finger directly at the bottom right corner of the page. He asked Kendall to explain to the court how Oscar Hayes' legally binding signature had magically appeared on a notarized asset transfer authorization, transferring $4 million to a shell company owned by Arthur Vance. He asked Kendall to explain how this document was dated and notarized for a Tuesday afternoon when Oscar Hayes was supposedly scheduled to be 3,000 miles away, locked in a Malibu beach house. The courtroom atmosphere instantly shattered, changing from sympathetic sorrow to electrifying and dangerous tension. The courtroom atmosphere shifted instantly. The manufactured sympathy that had filled the room evaporated, replaced by a thick and suffocating tension. Kendall stared at the heavily redacted document resting on the wooden ledge as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at his attorney Prescott, but the slick lawyer was busy frantically reviewing his own case files, completely blindsided by this catastrophic piece of evidence. Prescott had been hired to steamroll a confused senior citizen, not to defend a brazen forgery in open court. The judge leaned forward over the heavy oak bench, his brow furrowed in deep suspicion. He demanded that the witness answer the question immediately. Harrington repeated the inquiry with a slow, deliberate cadence that offered absolutely no escape. He asked how a man suffering from severe and rapid onset dementia could successfully negotiate, draft, and notarize a highly complex $4 million asset transfer to an offshore shell company while simultaneously experiencing a violent psychotic break in an airport terminal 3,000 miles away. Kendall gripped the edges of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stammered, offering a broken and entirely incoherent defense. He mumbled something about a pre-existing agreement and a misunderstanding of dates, but his voice lacked any conviction. His carefully constructed facade of the grieving, concerned son shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The judge did not look at him with pity anymore. The judge looked at him with the cold, calculating glare reserved for a perjurer caught red-handed. Kendall had walked into that courtroom attempting to trap me in a legal cage, but he had just triggered the steel jaws of a trap I had set for him. Harrington did not press for an answer. He let Kendall's pathetic, stuttering silence serve as a full and devastating confession. Harrington turned to the judge and stated he had no further questions for the witness. Kendall practically collapsed as he descended from the stand and returned to his chair at the petitioner's table. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Harrington then announced that he wished to call a surprise rebuttal witness to the stand. Prescott immediately jumped to his feet, shouting an aggressive objection, claiming a procedural violation and arguing that he had not been notified of this addition. The judge slammed his gavel and overruled the objection instantly, his patience with Kendall's legal team completely exhausted by the blatant display of fraudulent paperwork. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a sharp navy suit walked down the center aisle. Harrington introduced him as Special Agent Sullivan from the State Financial Fraud Division. The agent took the stand and delivered a testimony that acted as a precision airstrike on Kendall's entire case. Sullivan stated under oath that his department had executed a coordinated raid early this morning. They raided the private clinic of the clinical psychiatrist who had signed my devastating medical certificate. The agent testified that the doctor was currently in federal custody. The disgraced physician had already confessed to accepting a massive cash bribe to completely fabricate my medical history. He admitted that he had never evaluated me, never spoken to me, and had simply printed a fake diagnosis of paranoia and severe dementia based entirely on the financial demands of his clients. The court reporter typed furiously as Sullivan produced the bank routing numbers, linking the bribe directly back to the last remaining funds in Kendall's drained savings account. The prosecution table was a scene of absolute devastation. Courtney was sinking into her chair, her face hidden behind her hands as the sheer magnitude of their criminal exposure was laid bare before a judge. But Harrington was not finished. He called his final witness. He called me to the stand. I stood up, smoothed the front of my charcoal suit, and walked to the witness box with the steady, unyielding stride of a man who had built skyscrapers from nothing. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then I systematically dismantled every single lie my son had constructed. I did not speak like a confused, paranoid old man. I spoke with the terrifying, razor-sharp clarity of an apex predator defending his territory. I addressed the judge directly. I calmly recited the exact figures of my investment portfolios, the routing numbers of my corporate trusts, and the precise day-to-day operations of my commercial construction empire. I recounted the events at the airport without a shred of emotion, detailing exactly how they abandoned me to impress Courtney's white parents. I explained my subsequent defensive maneuvers, detailing the immediate cancellation of their luxury reservations and the lawful severing of my financial backing on their estate. I proved that my actions were not the erratic symptoms of a diseased mind, but the highly calculated, completely rational decisions of a CEO protecting his assets from parasitic thieves. I turned their medical competency hearing into a brutal, undeniable exposure of their own fraudulent conspiracy. I looked down at my son and stated clearly that a man does not suffer from paranoia when his family is actively plotting to rob him blind. The judge listened in absolute silence, completely captivated by the overwhelming mountain of undeniable facts. I did not just defend my sanity. I weaponized my intellect to completely crush their pathetic legal ambush. The judge had heard more than enough. He did not even retreat to his private chambers to deliberate. He leaned over the high bench and looked at Kendall and Courtney with absolute and unfiltered disgust. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a thunderous crack that echoed off the courtroom walls, signaling the absolute end of their scheme. He announced that he was dismissing the emergency guardianship petition with extreme prejudice. He declared the entire filing to be a malicious, fraudulent, and highly illegal abuse of the family court system. The judge stated that he was personally referring the matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution regarding the fabricated medical documents and perjury committed under oath. He made it clear that their attempt to exploit the legal system to steal from an elderly man would not go unpunished. Before the echo of the gavel could even fade from the room, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened once again. 2 uniformed police officers and a plainclothes detective walked purposefully down the center aisle. They completely bypassed the spectator gallery and walked straight toward the petitioner's table. Prescott, sensing the imminent destruction of his own legal career, immediately packed his briefcase and backed away from his own clients, distancing himself from the sinking ship. The detective instructed Kendall to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Kendall began to weep openly, begging the judge to reconsider, but the judge simply looked away. The detective read Kendall his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, formally charging him with felony document forgery, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and perjury. The cold, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Kendall's wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. My son, who had walked into this building wearing a tailored suit and an arrogant smirk, was now being physically dragged out of the courtroom in shackles. The trap had closed perfectly, leaving him with absolutely nothing. The cold, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Kendall's wrists echoed through the stunned, silent courtroom. It was the definitive sound of his entire carefully curated life snapping completely shut. But the most brutal and agonizing betrayal of the morning did not come from the imposing judge on the bench or the stern detectives making the arrest. It came from the woman sitting right beside him at the petitioner's table. The moment the lead detective secured the metal restraints and forcefully pulled Kendall to his feet, Courtney leaped from her wooden chair as if she had been sitting next to an active explosive device. The carefully constructed facade of the devoted, heartbroken wife vanished into thin air. In its place stood a cornered, panicked animal, absolutely desperate to save her own skin at any cost. She did not reach out to comfort the man she had married. She did not ask the arresting officers where they were taking her husband. Instead, she backed away rapidly, her hands raised high in the air, and began to scream at the top of her lungs. Her voice was shrill and pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. She shrieked to the judge, the armed police, and the shocked spectator gallery that she had absolutely no idea what Kendall had done. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my son, the man who had just risked federal prison to fund her endless luxury lifestyle, and threw him entirely under the bus. She cried out that he had maliciously manipulated her, that he had lied to her about his finances for years, and that she was merely an innocent, trusting victim of his psychotic criminal schemes. Kendall stopped struggling against the officer's grip. He turned his head slowly and looked at his screaming wife with a hollow, thoroughly devastated expression. He had alienated his own father, stolen from his family, and committed brazen perjury, all to secure her conditional love. Now, at the very first sign of real consequence, she was severing the tie without a single second of hesitation or regret. Courtney's loud theatrical performance of total victimhood was the exact signal her parents had been waiting for. Arthur and Diane Vance, who had spent the entire morning sitting in the front row of the gallery, radiating an aura of smug, untouchable superiority, suddenly sprang into frantic action. They rushed past the wooden courtroom divider, completely ignoring the bailiff's sharp orders to remain seated and maintain order. Arthur grabbed Courtney forcefully by the arm, physically pulling her away from the defense table and putting as much physical distance as possible between his precious daughter and my handcuffed son. Diane quickly wrapped her expensive cashmere shawl around Courtney's trembling shoulders, glaring at Kendall with absolute unfiltered disgust and venom. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of the scene was almost difficult to comprehend. Just a few days ago, Arthur and Diane were perfectly happy to actively participate in the hostile, illegal takeover of my $4 million retirement fund. They had gleefully accepted the luxury California vacations, the high-end dinners, and the premium lifestyle financed entirely by my stolen hard-earned money. But the exact moment the grand scheme collapsed into a very public felony arrest, their aristocratic loyalty and familial devotion dissolved into thin air. Arthur puffed out his chest, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and loudly declared to the remaining police officers that his prestigious family would cooperate fully with any federal or state investigation against Kendall. He boldly and arrogantly stated that they would be contacting their own legal counsel to file for an immediate annulment on Courtney's behalf, effectively erasing Kendall from their pristine family tree. He looked at Kendall like he was a piece of rotting garbage stuck to the bottom of his expensive Italian leather loafers. Kendall was physically dragged out of the heavy double doors by the detectives, his head hanging in total crushing defeat. He had sacrificed his bloodline and his morality for a family that treated him like a disposable, limitless credit card. Now the card was permanently declined, and they were tossing him in the trash without a second glance. Arthur, Diane, and Courtney did not linger in the courtroom to watch the rest of the procedural aftermath. They turned on their heels and marched toward the exit, their heads held high in a pathetic, transparent attempt to salvage their completely shattered public dignity. They truly believed they had successfully navigated the legal disaster. They thought that by loudly throwing Kendall to the wolves and playing the role of the deceived in-laws, they could simply wash their hands of the entire messy criminal affair. They fully expected to retreat to their elite social circles, spin a narrative of Kendall's deception, and pretend none of this catastrophic embarrassment had ever happened. They assumed the raging storm was over and that they had escaped the courthouse completely unscathed and legally protected. They were entirely, devastatingly wrong. I stood up slowly from the defense table, taking a moment to smooth the lapels of my impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Marcus Harrington stood up right beside me, his grip tightening on the handle of his pristine leather briefcase. We did not follow the slow-moving, whispering crowd exiting through the main gallery doors. We bypassed the congestion and exited the courtroom through a private side door, stepping directly into the wide, echoey, marble-floored hallway of the Fulton County Courthouse. We moved with deliberate, calculating purpose, cutting off their only main exit route to the elevators. As Arthur, Diane, and Courtney rounded the grand corner, heading briskly toward the glass doors and their perceived freedom, they stopped dead in their tracks. I was standing directly in the center of the wide hallway, an unmovable concrete pillar completely blocking their path. Arthur stiffened instantly, his face flushing with a volatile mix of defensive anger and lingering public humiliation. He tried to puff out his chest once again, desperately attempting to summon that fake old money authority he so heavily relied upon to intimidate others. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to issue a hollow, arrogant threat or demand that I step aside and let his family pass. I did not give him the chance to speak a single pathetic word. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I simply stared at him with the cold, dead, calculating gaze of a man who had already won the war. Arthur's manufactured bravado faltered and crumbled under my heavy silence. The arrogant patriarch who had insulted my intelligence, my heritage, and my career over the phone just weeks ago was now sweating profusely under the harsh, bright fluorescent lights of the courthouse corridor. He looked at Harrington, then back to me, a sickening realization washing over his face. He realized that we were not standing there to gloat over Kendall's arrest. We were there specifically for him. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy or relief. It was a solemn promise of absolute, inescapable financial destruction. Marcus Harrington stepped forward, opened his sleek leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, professionally bound legal folio. He did not hand the documents to Courtney or her mother. He extended his arm and pressed the heavy, dense folder directly into Arthur's shaking chest. Arthur instinctively grabbed the folder, his eyes darting nervously down to the bold, black, legal lettering printed on the cover page. I watched the remaining color drain entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing in the marble hallway. I took one deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between us, and spoke in a quiet, razor-sharp whisper that cut through the ambient noise of the courthouse. I informed Arthur that while he was busy coordinating my son's perjury and preparing to steal my retirement, I had been incredibly busy liquidating a calculated fraction of my corporate construction assets. I explained that I had used pure, untraceable liquid cash to systematically approach every single one of his hostile commercial lenders over the past 48 hours. I bought up his second residential mortgage, his third mortgage, and the massive defaulted corporate credit lines currently suffocating his failing import-export logistics company. I purchased his massive toxic debt for pennies on the dollar from banks that were absolutely desperate to offload his worthless liabilities. I watched Arthur's knees physically buckle as the horrifying, inescapable reality set in. He was no longer dealing with a multitude of faceless, bureaucratic banking institutions that he could delay or negotiate with. I told him that my private holding company was now his sole undisputed creditor. I owned the roof over his head, the luxury cars in his driveway, and the very company bearing his family name. I owned him entirely. The heavy wrought iron gates of my Atlanta estate stood tall and unyielding in the cool evening air. It was barely 24 hours after the spectacular collapse of their legal ambush in the Fulton County Courthouse. I was sitting quietly in my study reviewing the final liquidation schedules for Arthur Vance's failing logistics company when the perimeter security alarm chimed softly. I glanced at the high-definition monitor resting on my mahogany desk. Standing under the harsh, glaring illumination of the security floodlights were Arthur, Diane, and Courtney. They did not look like the polished old-money aristocrats who had sneered at my existence for the past 5 years. They looked like terrified, broken refugees. Arthur's designer suit was wrinkled and hastily thrown on. Diane's face was completely devoid of makeup, her posture slumped and utterly defeated. Courtney was shivering in the night air, clutching her arms, looking up at the camera lens with wide, desperate eyes. They had driven to my property in a blind panic after realizing the absolute finality of the legal documents I had pressed into Arthur's chest in the courthouse hallway. They buzzed the intercom continuously, the sound echoing through my quiet halls. I walked out of the front door and down the long driveway, stopping just on my side of the iron gate. I did not press the button to let them inside. As I approached, the unthinkable happened. Arthur Vance, the man who had loudly insulted my heritage and my intelligence, physically dropped to his knees on the cold concrete. Diane followed suit, pulling Courtney down with her into the dirt. The pristine, superior facade they had weaponized against me was entirely gone, replaced by raw, humiliating desperation. They pressed their hands against the cold iron bars, begging for a financial extension, pleading with a black man they had always considered vastly beneath them. Courtney pressed her tear-streaked face against the cold iron bars, her hands gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice cracked as she unleashed a torrent of pathetic, self-serving promises. She sobbed violently, claiming she had already contacted her lawyers to fast-track a divorce from Kendall. She loudly swore she was cutting all ties with my disgraced son, hoping that throwing him away like garbage would somehow earn my mercy. She begged me to look at her as an innocent victim, pleading that she was just a naive girl caught in Kendall's web of lies, and that she never truly wanted to hurt me. She pleaded with me to release the crushing grip on her father's logistics company and their primary residence. She cried that I was destroying their entire family over a simple misunderstanding, and that we could all sit down like civilized adults to work out a payment plan. Arthur choked back his own tears, his voice shaking, as he offered to sign over 60% of his business equity, begging for just a 30-day grace period to find a new commercial lender to buy out the massive debt. Diane wept silently, completely stripped of her sharp country club venom, her shoulders shaking as she realized the absolute destruction of her social standing. I stood on the immaculate driveway with my hands resting casually in my pockets. I looked down at them with a gaze entirely devoid of anger, pity, or compassion. I looked at them with the chilling emptiness of a corporate auditor finalizing a bankruptcy report. I did not see a tragic family in need of a savior. I saw the exact same predators who had stood in Terminal 4 of the International Airport just weeks ago. I looked at Courtney's crying eyes and vividly remembered the absolute disgust radiating from them when she told Kendall that my working-class black presence would ruin their luxury Malibu vacation. I remembered the smirk on her face when she suggested I would make their wealthy white friends uncomfortable and that I was nothing more than an aesthetic nuisance. I remembered Arthur's voice booming over the speakerphone, loudly proclaiming that my money could never wash the dirt off my skin and that Kendall was genetically flawed because of my bloodline. They had demanded I know my place. Now I was showing them theirs. I spoke with a quiet, razor-sharp clarity that cut cleanly through their pathetic sobbing. I told Courtney that her sudden willingness to discard her husband did not impress me. I told her it only proved her loyalty was bought and sold to the highest bidder, and that she was as hollow as the designer bags she carried. I informed Arthur that his business equity was completely worthless, a dead shell propped up by toxic debt I now legally owned, and that his offer was a mathematical insult to my intelligence. I did not raise my voice, but every single word struck like a physical blow. I reminded them that they had happily feasted on the fruits of my labor while actively plotting to lock me in a high-security psychiatric ward to steal whatever was left. I told them that mercy is a privilege strictly reserved for the repentant, and they were only sorry they had been outsmarted and caught. I stepped back from the iron gate and delivered the final, uncompromising verdict. I stated that my holding company was not in the business of granting grace periods to malicious racist debtors. I informed Arthur that the asset seizure protocols, the commercial foreclosure orders, and the operational freeze on his business accounts had already been filed with the county sheriff and the bankruptcy courts. The liquidation would not be delayed by a single minute. I looked directly into Arthur's terrified, bloodshot eyes and announced that the formal foreclosure and physical seizure of their primary estate would be executed by armed deputies at precisely 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I advised them to spend the rest of their miserable evening packing what little they had left instead of begging at a gate they would never cross. I turned my back on their hysterical screaming, their hands reaching fruitlessly through the iron bars, and walked slowly back to my front door, leaving them kneeling in the dark. Promptly at 8 o'clock the following morning, the reality of my promise arrived at their doorstep. A heavily armed convoy of county sheriff deputies and commercial asset recovery agents pulled up to the Vance family's sprawling gated estate. There were no further negotiations and absolutely no delays. The officers executed the legal seizure with swift, cold institutional efficiency. The heavy oak doors of the country club mansion were forcefully deadbolted by the authorities, and bright orange notices of foreclosure were plastered across the grand entrance and the garage doors. Arthur and Diane were forced to carry their hastily packed cardboard boxes down their own manicured driveway, their aristocratic neighbors watching from behind drawn curtains in stunned, judgmental silence. The generational wealth they had bragged about was officially erased. Courtney, the woman who had sneered at my simple sweater and deemed my presence a profound embarrassment, found herself dragging her heavy, scuffed suitcases through the mud of her former driveway. Without access to her father's drained bank accounts or Kendall's stolen trust funds, her elite living options evaporated instantly. She was forced to hail a cheap, battered taxi that took her miles away from the affluent, tree-lined suburbs of her youth. She arrived at a dilapidated, neon-lit weekly boarding house situated in one of the most impoverished industrial sectors of the city. It was a crumbling, stained building surrounded by cracked asphalt chain-link fences and the constant roar of highway traffic. It was exactly the kind of rundown working-class neighborhood she had spent her entire life mocking with profound elite disgust. She carried her ruined designer bags up a flight of rusted metal stairs and unlocked the door to a cramped, mildew-scented room with peeling wallpaper. The supreme irony was perfectly complete. The woman who believed herself entirely too superior to share first-class air with me was now permanently grounded in the absolute lowest tier of the city, stripped of her name, her money, and her manufactured pride. The fluorescent lights in the county detention center buzzed with a harsh and relentless frequency. I sat on a cold, bolted steel stool in the sterile visitors' room. A thick panel of smudged, bulletproof plexiglass separated me from the holding area. The heavy metal door on the opposite side clanked open. A corrections officer escorted my son into the room. Kendall did not walk with the arrogant, chest-out swagger he used to display at his exclusive country clubs. He shuffled forward. His shoulders were completely hunched and his eyes darted nervously around the bleak concrete walls. He was wearing a baggy, bright orange canvas jumpsuit. The abrasive color completely stripped away the polished high society facade he had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to maintain. Without his custom-tailored Italian blazers, his expensive Swiss watches, and his perfectly styled haircuts, the absolute frailty of his character was brutally exposed. The prison uniform did not make him look hardened or dangerous. It made him look incredibly small, pathetic, and utterly cowardly. He sat down on the stool across from me. His hands were shaking violently as he reached for the heavy black plastic receiver hanging on the partition wall. I picked up my receiver, slowly bringing it to my ear. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not press my hand against the glass to console him. I just stared at the man who had conspired to steal my entire life's work and lock me in a psychiatric ward. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with raw, unfiltered terror. The thick glass between us was a perfect physical representation of the permanent boundary he had created. I waited for him to speak first. Kendall pressed the receiver tightly against his ear. The moment we made eye contact, he completely broke down. Tears streamed down his pale, sunken face. He began to sob uncontrollably, his chest heaving with heavy, panicked breaths. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not immediately apologize for the immense pain he had caused. His very first instinct was to beg for financial salvation. He pleaded with me to post his massive bail. He whined that he could not survive another night in his crowded holding cell. He claimed the other inmates terrified him and the food was inedible. He begged me to call Marcus Harrington and transfer the necessary funds to the bondsman so he could sleep in a real bed. He promised he would do anything I asked if I just got him out of that orange jumpsuit. I remained perfectly still. My expression was carved from solid stone. I let his desperate sobbing fill my ear without interrupting. When he realized his tears were not softening my resolve, he pivoted to his second tactic. He began shifting the blame. He aggressively threw his wife and his in-laws under the bus, just as Courtney had done to him in the courtroom. He cried that it was never his idea to forge the medical documents. He claimed Courtney had relentlessly pressured him to secure a massive influx of cash. He blamed the suffocating toxic standards of her elite family. He spoke about the overwhelming burden of trying to measure up to Arthur and Diane's affluent country club lifestyle. He confessed that they constantly made him feel inferior, reminding him that he did not come from generational wealth. He admitted he was absolutely terrified of losing Courtney and the prestigious social status she provided. He said the fear of returning to a normal middle-class life drove him to sheer desperation. He wept as he admitted he had cowardly sold out his own father just to maintain a shallow, vain illusion of success. He sacrificed his heritage, his morals, and his family simply to buy the temporary tolerance of people who secretly despised him. Every word he spoke only cemented my absolute disgust. He was a 38-year-old man acting like a helpless victim of circumstance. I gripped the plastic receiver and finally spoke. My voice was low, steady, and devoid of any paternal warmth. I told him that Arthur and Diane did not forge my signature on those retirement transfer documents. I reminded him that Courtney did not force him to stand in a family court and commit brazen perjury under oath. I told him that nobody held a gun to his head and forced him to leave his father stranded at an airport terminal. He had made a calculated, deliberate choice. He chose to look at the man who had wiped his tears when he was a child and see nothing but an expendable bank account. He chose to align himself with predators. I explained that the pressure of high society was a pathetic excuse for deep-seated moral rot. I reminded him of my own past. I told him how I had faced real visceral racism and crushing poverty while building my construction company from the dirt. I faced powerful men who wanted to see me fail, but I never once compromised my integrity or betrayed my family to gain their favor. I fought the world to give him a life of privilege, and he took that privilege and mutated it into profound weakness. Kendall shook his head frantically, pressing his free hand against the smudged glass. He begged me to understand that he was a changed man. He swore that hitting rock bottom in the county jail had opened his eyes. He promised to divorce Courtney, seek professional therapy, and work for minimum wage in my company if I just paid the bail. He cried that I was his only hope. He pleaded with me to remember the good times, bringing up memories of his childhood, hoping to strike a nerve of nostalgic guilt. He was deploying every single manipulative tactic he had learned over the years. But he was speaking to a man who had already grieved the loss of his son. The man sitting on the other side of the glass was a complete stranger who had tried to destroy me. I looked at the desperate, weeping man on the other side of the partition. I felt a profound sense of closure. The lingering doubts about whether I had been too harsh or too unforgiving completely vanished. I slowly stood up from the bolted steel stool. I reached down and methodically buttoned the front of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I picked up the plastic receiver one last time. I spoke with a quiet, devastating finality. I told Kendall that a man is defined by how he handles the consequences of his own actions. I informed him that my holding company would not authorize a single penny for his bail, his defense attorneys, or his commissary account. He was entirely on his own. I gently placed the heavy black receiver back onto its metal cradle, cutting off the audio feed of his pathetic sobbing. Kendall's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He slammed his fists against the thick plexiglass, screaming my name. Even through the soundproof barrier, I could hear the muffled, frantic pounding of his hands. He pressed his face against the window, his mouth wide open in a silent, agonizing shriek of absolute despair. A corrections officer immediately stepped forward, grabbing Kendall by the shoulder of his bright orange jumpsuit to forcefully pull him away from the glass. I did not linger to watch him struggle. I turned my back on the visitation booth and walked steadily toward the exit. I did not look over my shoulder. I pushed open the heavy metal doors of the detention center and stepped out into the crisp, clean air of the Atlanta afternoon. The thick steel door slammed shut behind me with a loud, echoing finality, permanently sealing my treacherous son inside the cage he had built for himself. The air inside Marcus Harrington's downtown corner office was impeccably climate-controlled and completely silent. I sat across the wide glass desk from my attorney. The sprawling skyline of Atlanta stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Spread out before me was a stack of freshly printed legal documents bound in heavy stock paper. It was my completely revised last will and testament alongside the formation documents for a new, irrevocable trust. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen Harrington offered me. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I flipped to the final execution page and signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes. The dark ink dried instantly, legally cementing the absolute erasure of my only son. I had explicitly instructed Harrington to remove Kendall's name from every single asset, property, deed, holding company, and financial portfolio I possessed. I did not leave him a nominal $1 insult to prevent a legal challenge. I did not include a standard no contest clause. I simply had him legally expunged from my legacy as if he had never been born. Harrington watched me slide the signed documents back across the desk. He nodded in silent professional approval. The $4 million retirement fund that Kendall and Courtney had conspired to steal was now permanently locked away behind an impenetrable wall of corporate law. My commercial construction empire, the residential properties, and my liquid capital were completely insulated from any future claims by my disgraced bloodline. The parasitic branch of my family tree was officially severed and cauterized. I handed the pen back to Harrington. The immense weight of a generational burden was entirely lifted from my shoulders. My wealth was no longer a curse waiting to be plundered by greedy, entitled heirs. It was now a finely tuned weapon ready to be deployed exactly how I saw fit. I did not just lock my fortune away to collect dust in a sterile underground vault. I repurposed the entirety of my life's work to build something that would outlast me and outshine the disgraceful shadow Kendall had cast. With Harrington executing the swift and complex legal maneuvers, I transferred the vast majority of my liquid wealth and corporate equity into a newly established, fully funded philanthropic entity. I named it the Corinne Hayes Engineering Foundation. It was a powerful tribute to the woman who had stood by my side when we had absolutely nothing but dirt on our boots and a shared dream. Corinne had always believed in the transformative power of education and the undeniable strength of our community. She would have been profoundly disgusted by the hollow, materialistic monster our son had become. This foundation was my meticulous way of ensuring her true, honorable legacy survived. The trust was expertly designed to provide comprehensive full-ride scholarships, generous housing stipends, and direct business grants to brilliant, underprivileged Black youth pursuing degrees in civil engineering, architecture, and construction management. I wanted to find the hungry, driven kids who grew up in the same tough, unforgiving neighborhoods I did. I wanted to fund the young men and women who possessed a relentless work ethic, but lacked the financial safety net to break through the systemic barriers of the corporate world. I was taking the immense privilege Kendall had so casually squandered and handing it directly to the exact demographic Courtney and her elitist parents constantly looked down upon with such deep-seated prejudice. The launch of the foundation was not a quiet, private affair held behind closed doors. I instructed my public relations team to organize a massive press conference at the most prestigious convention center in downtown Atlanta. The local and national media were already completely obsessed with the dramatic saga of the construction mogul who had publicly decimated his gold-digging family. The grand ballroom was packed to absolute capacity with journalists, news anchors, local politicians, and community leaders. Camera lenses tracked my every move as I walked up the center aisle and took my place behind the polished wooden podium. The bright, rapid flashes of the cameras illuminated the room like lightning. I looked out over the sea of reporters, adjusted the microphones, and formally announced the creation of the Corinne Hayes Engineering Foundation. I did not just announce a modest charitable donation to save face. I revealed the staggering initial endowment of $50 million. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded room. The seasoned reporters scrambled to take notes as I detailed the comprehensive scope of the scholarships and the exact mechanics of the community grants. I explained that my commercial construction firm would begin aggressively recruiting and mentoring these young graduates, creating a direct and heavily funded pipeline for Black excellence in an industry that had historically tried to shut us out. I was systematically dismantling the hoard of wealth my son had tried to steal and utilizing it to forge a powerful, unstoppable army of young professionals who actually understood the profound value of hard work. The press conference was being broadcast live across multiple local news networks and streaming globally online. I knew Kendall was likely watching from a small communal television screen inside the county detention center, surrounded by the very inmates he had begged me to save him from. I looked directly into the primary broadcast camera and delivered my final, devastating public statement. I spoke with absolute unwavering conviction about the profound difference between building a legacy and leeching off one. I stated that true wealth is never inherited. It is forged through relentless discipline, unwavering resilience, and unyielding self-respect. I warned the captive audience about the toxic rot of entitlement and the highly dangerous illusion of unearned status. I declared that I refused to let the fruits of my lifelong labor be consumed by parasitic greed and hollow social climbing. I wanted my fortune to build bridges for the hungry, not padded cages for the weak. My words were a masterful surgical strike against the exact philosophy that had driven my son to commit federal felonies. It was the ultimate irrefutable condemnation of his entire existence. The powerful speech instantly went viral, trending across all major social media platforms within minutes. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive and deeply inspired. By framing my wealth around community empowerment and Black excellence, I completely stripped Kendall of any remaining opportunity to play the victim or appeal to public sympathy through his lawyers. He was no longer just a disgraced son awaiting trial. He was a pathetic, cautionary tale of squandered privilege permanently eclipsed by the monumental, undeniable good I was doing for the world. The trap was not just closed, it was welded shut. 6 months passed with the rapid and unyielding momentum of a freight train. The changing of the seasons brought a stark, brutal reality to the people who once believed they were utterly untouchable. The contrast between their past arrogance and their present existence was a masterpiece of absolute karma. Inside the sterile concrete walls of the state penitentiary, Kendall was no longer a junior executive pretending to be a real estate titan. He wore a faded, oversized orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking, defeated frame. His days of chartering private yachts and commanding VIP bottle service were completely eradicated. Instead, he spent his early mornings gripping a heavy bleach-soaked mop, scrubbing the filthy stainless steel toilets of the maximum security cell block. His soft, manicured hands were now cracked, bleeding, and calloused from the harsh industrial chemicals and grueling manual labor. He worked in total, humiliating silence, constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of the hardened, violent criminals he was now forced to call his peers. Every single day was a waking nightmare of his own making. 300 miles away, Courtney was experiencing her own custom-built hell. The pristine white cashmere coats and expensive designer sunglasses were permanently gone. She stood behind the greasy, sticky counter of a rundown 24-hour fast food franchise on the decaying industrial outskirts of Atlanta. She wore a hideous, oversized polyester uniform deeply stained with fry oil and stale ketchup. Her blonde hair, once perfectly styled for exclusive country club brunches, was shoved unceremoniously under a cheap, mandatory nylon hairnet. She was forced to smile and apologize to angry, impatient customers who yelled at her over missing chicken nuggets and cold French fries. The woman who once claimed my Black working-class presence would ruin her luxury aesthetic was now scrubbing spilled soda off dirty linoleum floors for minimum wage. Every time the bell above the glass door chimed, she flinched, terrified that someone from her former elite social circle might walk in and witness her absolute degradation. The absolute and terrifying destruction of their aristocratic facade was entirely complete. The Vance family name, once a symbol of arrogant old money superiority, had been completely vaporized from the Atlanta elite. Arthur and Diane did not survive the catastrophic financial implosion I had engineered. When my holding company executed the final commercial foreclosure, their sprawling multi-million-dollar estate was auctioned off to the highest bidder in less than 30 days. Stripped of their home, their country club memberships, and their logistics company, they were forced to pack their few remaining worthless possessions into a rented moving truck in the dead of night. They fled the state of Georgia in absolute disgrace, relocating to a tiny, obscure town in the Midwest where no one knew their name or the humiliating details of their spectacular downfall. They were completely erased from the high society circles they worshipped. Their former wealthy friends and corporate allies treated them like a highly contagious disease, refusing to even acknowledge they ever existed. I did not spend my time gloating over their miserable demise. I was entirely focused on the profound peace that comes from absolute liberation. I stood on the expansive wraparound glass balcony of the exact same Malibu beachfront villa I had originally booked 6 months ago. The same $90,000 luxury estate I had reserved for a family that never deserved it. This time I did not book it to bridge a gap or buy the affection of an ungrateful son. I booked it entirely for myself. The cool, salty Pacific breeze washed over my face as I looked out at the endless expanse of the ocean. The private chef I had hired was inside the pristine marble kitchen, quietly preparing a 5-course gourmet dinner. The 2 luxury sports cars I had rented were parked securely in the private driveway. I stood there breathing in the crisp, clean air, wearing a simple, comfortable linen shirt and slacks. I did not need to wear a heavy, expensive suit to prove my worth to anyone. I had reclaimed absolute, undisputed control over my fortune, my legacy, and my life. The Corinne Hayes Engineering Foundation was already fully operational, actively recruiting brilliant, ambitious Black students who knew the true value of hard work. I had successfully redirected the massive wealth Kendall tried to steal and turned it into a powerful, unstoppable force for community empowerment. The empire I built from dirt and concrete was safe, completely insulated from the toxic greed of parasitic heirs. The late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the California sky in brilliant, fiery strokes of deep crimson, gold, and violet. The vibrant colors reflected off the crashing waves, creating a breathtaking panoramic view that belonged entirely to me. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating father walking on eggshells to please a disrespectful daughter-in-law. I was an apex predator who had successfully defended his territory and eliminated the threat with surgical precision. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound, unshakable tranquility. The heavy burden of false family loyalty was gone, replaced by the lightweight, invigorating reality of absolute freedom. Society often demands that parents offer infinite, unconditional forgiveness to their children, regardless of the severity of their betrayals. We are conditioned to believe that blood requires us to endure endless abuse, financial exploitation, and blatant disrespect in the name of keeping the peace. But I had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my entire life. Sometimes timely cruelty is the highest, most profound proof of self-respect. Sparing the rod and funding the delusion does not create love. It only breeds entitled monsters. I refused to let my twilight years be consumed by their toxic, hollow vanity. I reached over to the small glass patio table and picked up a crystal goblet filled with a vintage, full-bodied red wine. I held the heavy glass in my calloused hand, feeling the smooth, cool crystal against my skin. I raised the glass toward the brilliant sinking sun, offering a silent toast to Corinne, to my hard-fought empire, and to the undeniable power of unyielding boundaries. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The rich, complex flavor settled warmly in my chest. I smiled as I looked out over the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. There was absolutely no lingering guilt in my heart. There was no room for weak, sentimental forgiveness. There was only the sweet, intoxicating, and absolute satisfaction of a man who had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious. I stood alone on the balcony, perfectly content, exactly where I belonged. As I stood on that Malibu balcony and let the cool Pacific breeze wash over my face, I realized there was one final profound lesson I had to accept. It is a lesson about the dangerous myth of generational wealth and the lethal trap of unconditional financial love. Society conditions us to believe that the ultimate measure of a parent's success is how much they can leave behind for their children. We are taught to break our backs, to sacrifice our youth, our sleep, and our peace of mind, all to build a towering fortress of financial security, so our offspring will never have to feel the biting cold of poverty. I believed that myth with my entire soul. When I was hauling steel beams and pouring concrete in the sweltering Georgia heat, I motivated myself with the image of my son never having to struggle. I thought my money would be a shield for Kendall. I thought it would protect him from the harsh, racist realities of the corporate world. I thought I was giving him armor. I did not realize I was actually handing him a loaded weapon and aiming it directly at his own character. The truth is that wealth without the foundational discipline of struggle is not a blessing. It is a highly corrosive poison. Every time I wrote a check to cover Kendall's lavish expenses, every time I quietly funneled cash to pay the mortgage on a mansion he could not afford, I was systematically robbing him of his own resilience. I stole his opportunity to fail, and in doing so, I completely obliterated his ability to grow into a man. I constructed a beautiful, comfortable cage of privilege around him, and inside that cage, his morality simply atrophied. Courtney and her blatantly racist, opportunistic family were not the root cause of Kendall's downfall. They were merely a symptom of the profound weakness I had unknowingly cultivated. When you give a person everything they have not earned, they do not feel gratitude. They feel a twisted, insatiable entitlement. They begin to look at you not as a human being, not as a father who bled for their comfort, but as an infinite, unfeeling resource. They begin to calculate your expiration date because your continued existence is just a temporary delay in their absolute control over your assets. When I look at the applications for the Corinne Hayes Engineering Foundation, I see the faces of young men and women who remind me of myself 40 years ago. They have calluses on their hands from working night shifts. They have tired eyes from studying until dawn in cramped, unheated apartments. They do not expect the world to hand them a silver platter. They only ask for a single fighting chance to prove their worth. Reading their essays, I feel a profound sense of pride that my wealth will be the catalyst for their success. It is a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the man sitting in a county jail cell who had every possible advantage handed to him on a velvet cushion and still chose the path of deceit and cowardice. I realize that true generational wealth is not the transfer of liquid capital or real estate portfolios. True generational wealth is the transfer of grit, integrity, and unbreakable character. Without those pillars, financial inheritance is nothing but a countdown to moral bankruptcy. There is a deeply ingrained, almost sacred dogma in our culture that demands infinite forgiveness for family. We are constantly told that blood is thicker than water, that you must always turn the other cheek, and that a parent must endure any level of disrespect because family is forever. That is a dangerous, manipulative lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. Toxic blood will poison your entire body if you lack the absolute courage to amputate the infected limb. It goes against every natural biological instinct a parent possesses to deliberately orchestrate the ruin of their own child. It was agonizing to listen to the police place my son in handcuffs. It was sickening to watch his life collapse into a pile of garbage bags on a wet lawn. But I had to accept that rescuing him again would have been the ultimate act of cruelty. I had to let him drown in the severe, crushing consequences of his own arrogant choices because hitting the absolute unforgiving bottom was the only way he would ever learn how to swim. Radical self-respect requires ruthless boundaries. You cannot negotiate with parasites, and you cannot buy the loyalty of people who inherently despise you. When Courtney looked at me at that airport and saw an embarrassing working-class black man who did not fit her luxury aesthetic, she revealed a truth that no amount of my money could ever erase. I realized that my dignity was infinitely more valuable than my desire to keep up the appearance of a happy, unified family. The profound liberation I feel now watching the sunset over the ocean does not come from the petty satisfaction of revenge. It comes from the complete realignment of my life with my true core values. I took the fortune that was rotting my son's soul and redirected it to ignite the futures of brilliant, hungry, and driven youth who actually understand the value of a dollar and the dignity of hard work. I am no longer funding a pathetic illusion. I am building a real, enduring legacy in the name of the woman I loved. The greatest tragedy of my life was not losing my son to greed, but almost losing myself in the desperate attempt to save him. If you spend your twilight years walking on eggshells and compromising your own peace to appease entitled, disrespectful people, you are not being a good parent. You are simply a hostage in a prison you are paying for. I chose to break the chains, freeze the accounts, and walk away with my head held high. Do not ever set yourself on fire simply to keep ungrateful people warm. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs the courage to cut off toxic family members and reclaim their own self-worth.